That's a great observation and a great statement. I remember in seminary we discussed these bounded sets versus unbounded sets. And the bounded set was everything fits in this nice little tidy God box that I've got in my life. Everything is black and white. We never enter into the gray. We never wrestle with the tension of a struggle of elements of faith. And it's all just very nice and tidy and tied up with a bow, very much like a Hallmark movie. You go through it at the end, you've got your resolution. You know, it always ends great, and you leave feeling warm and fuzzy, and you never think of it again. And then there's this area of the unbounded sets of reality where it might not be as black and white or as clear cut as I think. I've got to enter into it and wrestle around with things. And since we're talking about sort of building the conflict and where it goes from there, my wife and I recently just finished watching a TV show, sort of a mini series called Sanditon, which was based on an unfinished Jane Austen novel of the same name. And I can't remember, there were several episodes, 7 or 8 episodes, and we knew that it had been based from previous reviews, knew it was based off of this Jane Austen novel that was unfinished. And so in the back of our minds, we thought it would be interesting to see how the director sort of works in their own solution to the end or resolution. And we get to the last episode and things are starting to be tied up a little bit. And then it just ends out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. And I looked at Teresa and I said, oh my goodness, I can't wait for season 2. And we look and there is no season 2 and there's no next episode. And so we frantically search any reviews or articles on hope for some sort of resolution, and there was none. And we thought, man, that was just the worst way to end. Jane Austen would have never done anything like that. Mm-hmm. But in fact, I think the writers who took it to screen did a great job at sort of leaving on this cliffhanger, which really mirrors a lot of life, because I don't know that, just as you illustrated, that there were all these nice, tied up, tidy, bow-bound packages that were left for us in the New Testament. There was this element of continued struggle and searching through the Holy Spirit's guidance and the wisdom of the church to continue on in these elements of Christianity and these other stories. They with Christianity, there's this now but not yet expectation. And I feel like a lot of these stories of tension that we remember well have those hallmarks and elements there right in the middle of them.
Yeah, I mean, when Jesus said, to Peter about John, what's it to you if he's going to remain, until I come back, and there were all these stories of, Jesus was going to come back, imminently. I mean, after his resurrection and ascension. And then century after century after century goes by, and that's not what we like. We just don't like that as people. But again, that's the wisdom working itself out, of our beliefs. And so if we can't depend on a quick, easy resolution, then what? We've got to figure this out, basically for ourselves with, the guidance that we already have been given. So, it's not to say that there shouldn't be resolution. As I said, there are definitely times and definitely movies and TV shows and books where you're just like, are you kidding me? That either there's absolutely no resolution, or it's so tidy and cleaned up that it's not realistic. So you do have to be careful of that, and you have to take into account that human beings really do like resolution, but at the same time that, and I'm speaking now again of the writing, that there needs to be as much emphasis on process as product. And so, what is the journey? What is the path? And if the whole point of the thing is to get to the product, to get to the goal, then that's really not much of a story.
What would you say are some tendencies that need to be guarded against in writing stories that would negatively impact the communication of that?
Well, I think storytelling requires a certain amount of what has come to be known as cultural humility. The National Institutes of Health defines cultural humility as a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, whereby the individual not only learns about another's culture, but one starts with the examination of his or her own beliefs and cultural identities. So where cultural humility exists, there's an appreciation of the encountered culture without the need to force one's culture on other people. Though one culture may never adopt the ways of another, nonetheless, there is respect for the other's way of living. And Eisner says it this way, quote, "One should not think one has cornered truth. What one has cornered is agreement." So here's an example that I read one time that I think kind of makes this point. Some missionaries in Congo had trouble in building rapport with people. And so finally, one old man explained the people's hesitancy to befriend the missionaries. He said, "When you came, you brought your strange ways. You brought cans of food. On the outside of one can was a picture of corn. When you opened it, inside was corn, and you ate it. Outside another was a picture of meat, and inside was meat, and you ate it. And then when you had your baby, you brought in small cans. On the outside was a picture of babies, and you opened it and fed the inside to your child." So related to this idea of culture and humility is the need to fight the tendency to oversimplify a complex situation. In the 1960s, operant conditioning was all the rage in education, and that's because it was simple. It was stimulus and response. Results from laboratory rats making their way through a maze were applied to students learning in the classroom. What could go wrong? Well, basically everything. Why? Because it grossly oversimplified the teaching and learning process. This was also the mistake of cognitive science, which tried to reduce everything down to what takes place in a computer model. One of the compelling arguments of the use of qualitative methods is that they capture some of the inherent complexity of life. As Eisner notes, nothing in connoisseurship as a form of appreciation requires that our judgments be positive. What is required or desired is that our experiences be complex, subtle, and informed. And I think that really describes good storytelling. We don't oversimplify the story. We also don't assume anything on the part of the reader, much as the missionaries were kind of assuming that other cultures would understand what in the world they were doing. So the saying in the movie industry is show, don't tell. We need to adopt a similar approach, I think, with nonfiction writing, and especially storytelling. So let me read you a passage from Yann Martel's wonderful book, Life of Pi, which I just finished reading. He says, "I wish I could convey the perfection of a seal slipping into the water, or a spidery monkey swinging from point to point, or a lion merely turning its head. But language founders in such seas. Better to picture it in your head if you want to feel it." So I think that kind of captures some of the idea of show, don't tell. It's not to say that you shouldn't tell sometimes, especially in nonfiction. That's almost unavoidable. But the more you tell, and attempt to parse whatever it is that you're trying to describe into, bite-sized, pre-chewed pieces, the more you're going to lose your reader's interest and attention. Who likes simple, one-dimensional characters in stories? We want real flesh and blood characters that look like us, but we also want to understand what's important about them and why should we care about them. I recently read that although about 150 extras were used in the filming of Titanic, James Cameron created backstories for all of them and met with all of them to explain the importance of their character. A little over 50 years ago, a journalist wanted to write about professional football, but he wanted to do it from the inside. So George Plimpton joined the Detroit Lions as a rookie quarterback, despite never having played football before. This was, in fact, the beginning of what is known as participant journalism or guerrilla journalism. The account of his experience with the football team, which was called Paper Lion, became a bestseller in a movie. Plimpton went through 4 weeks of training camp, and his experience culminated in an intra-squad game in front of fans. The book is insightful and hilarious, no journalistic account like it had ever been written. But an important aspect of Plimpton's writing is what might be called self-disclosure. All the way through the book, we are told not only what is happening circumstantially, but we are also allowed to peek into his mind and the alternating joy and terror he was experiencing. Though he set out to report on football, we are drawn into the story because of how intensely personal it is.
I like that, and I'm feeling drawn in already. Interestingly enough, your book, Moments That Matter, is filled with storytelling, and you do a tremendous job of it. And the reader, which anyone listening, if you haven't gotten it, you'll make sure you really want to get that. But is there a chance that you could read us a story from one of your books that kind of illustrates what you've been talking about?
Yes, I can. If I would choose any story to tell you, it would be from chapter 3 called No Nukes. So here it is, at least part of it. An important account in the comedy of errors that was my choice of career took place in spring semester of my senior year in college. It was not a roadblock per se, but that's what it proved to be in the end. Apparently, the Navy had not quite achieved its quota of officers accepted for nuclear power program, either ships or submarines. And so a second invitation was sent to the NROTC units asking for nominees. Despite my barely 3.0 GPA and despite now being a math education major, I was asked if I wanted to apply. Me? I won't lie, I was honored and not a little puffed up about the whole thing. Per my modus operandi of long standing, I accepted the invitation, thinking little of the consequences that would result in my taking such a path. Immediately, I started hearing, quote, Rickover stories, both factual and fantastic. Admiral Hyman Rickover was known as the father of the nuclear navy. It was his vision in the late 1940s and early 1950s that had launched the first nuclear-powered submarine, the USS Nautilus. Unlike some pioneers, however, Rickover was not content with simply starting the program. In fact, he oversaw every aspect of it. In one way, you can appreciate why, since his reputation depended on the things going well. Yet, his level of control was unprecedented, including interviewing every officer who worked on the program. Though by the time of my invitation, Rickover was already 79 years old, he still had a firm grasp on the program, and for good or for bad, for humor or humiliation, I would soon have my own Rickover story to tell. Not long after I accepted the invitation and my name was sent to Washington, D.C., I experienced two events back-to-back that set up a clearness committee moment for me, one that I had sadly chosen to ignore. Mid-March of 1979, the movie China Syndrome was released, a fictionalized account of an accident at a nuclear power plant. It was a wrenching story of bureaucracy's triumph over good judgment and the innocent casualties that piled up along the way. The movie probably would have had limited access and success had it not been for a nuclear power related event that took place that same month. At the end of March, there was an actual nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island. This was life imitating art, fantasy made reality. Suddenly, my opting for the future in nuclear power did not seem the wisest choice, which it most certainly was not. The Clearness Committee moment was provided by my friends who asked me if I'd seen the movie, if I'd heard about the accident. They wondered how I could continue with the planned interview. This was my moment to reconsider, and I could have, because up to that point, nothing had changed in terms of my duty assignment after graduation. But I chose to ignore the warnings. Why? You have to understand the deep obligation I feel to plans and commitments. In my younger life, I would never have considered rocking the bureaucratic boat. I had an excessive respect for authority, born primarily from my father's influence. As Parker Palmer has said of his own life, lacking insight into my own limitations and potentials, I had allowed ego and ethics to lead me into a situation that my soul could not abide. So it was in that April, I dutifully traveled to Washington to be interviewed. The day of my interview was filled with highs and lows, traveling by taxi to Crystal City, past all the cherry trees in full bloom, beautifully mirrored in the Potomac River. 4 separate interviews on the subjects of math, physics, chemistry, and electrical engineering, asking me to solve problems, all in real time while the interviewer watched me. I was told the interviews had resulted in a draw, 2 in favor, 2 against, and the need for a tiebreaker. There was still a chance, and I was determined to make the best of it. It is staggering the extent to which we can talk ourselves into believing something is God ordained simply based on circumstances working themselves out in our favor. Case in point, my 5th interview was with an engineer, which was concerning until he put the problem he wanted solved in front of me. He asked me to generate the volume formula for a cone from the area formula for a right triangle by rotating the triangle on an axis. Does that sound intimidating to you? It shouldn't. It's basic calculus. And as it happened, it was one of the problems I had just studied the night before. But it got better. As soon as he handed me the problem, his phone rang and he took the call. I began writing out the solution in the only way I knew how, which was as a mathematician, not an engineer. That means my notation was perfect and all the steps were carefully written out. When the engineer got off the phone, I handed him the solution, which had taken me only 2 or 3 minutes to write. He looked it over for a long time, and then he gave me one of the greatest compliments you can give a mathematician. That's so elegant, he said. I never would have done it that way. I could just feel God smiling down on me. As a result, the tie was broken in my favor, and my meeting with Admiral Rickover was set. Rickover's interviews were legendary, and I had heard all the stories. Supposedly, it was his goal to get you flustered, even angry, to see how you responded under pressure. The most infamous of all the accounts was of Rickover telling a hapless midshipman, "Do something to make me mad." As the tale is told, the nuclear power candidate noticed a model ship on the admiral's desk and promptly threw it on the floor, and the model shattered into 1,000 pieces. Apparently, the tactic worked, and the midshipman was accepted into the program. I knew I could never pull off a stunt like that. However, I'm pretty even-tempered, and so walking into his austere office, I was confident that I could withstand Rickover's tirades and tricks. The small man behind the large desk commanded, "Sit down," without even looking at me. I suspected there would be no pleasant chit-chat. He said, "It says here that you have a 2.0 average in math." Well, I thought, my average in school isn't that great, but I know it's not 2.0. "No, Admiral, it's about 3.0. "I'm looking at the paper and it says 2.0, he yelled. Again, I came back to him. "It must be an error, sir." Well, as it turns out, we were talking about 2 different things. He was talking about a written test I had taken earlier in the day, not my courses at college. Yet for once, my cluelessness seemed to be an advantage. I think standing up to him got his attention. Now his voice was elevated. "What's your major?" "Math education, sir." "Math education? What do I want with a teacher in my nuclear navy?" Awkward silence. "Do you have a girlfriend?" This question worried me. In another infamous encounter, Rickover asked a midshipman whether he had a girlfriend, whether he loved her, and whether he was going to marry her. He was then told to call her up and tell her the wedding was off. When the midshipman dutifully called his girlfriend, told her the bad news, and then hung up, Rickover told him he would never take such a spineless person in his program. "Yes, sir, I have a girlfriend." "Are you going to get married?" "Yes, sir." I held my breath. "What's her major?" "Psychology." "That's perfect. Psychology and education. Get out of my office." And that was it. In fact, that's always the way interviews ended. No matter if you did well in the interview or not, the Admiral always had the final word. "Get out of my office." I was quite sure I had not impressed Rickover. Once out of his office, all candidates were left to shuffle down a lonely hallway, finally encountering a desk occupied by one of his secretaries. It was her job to give the candidate the news. She handed me a piece of paper and said, "Congratulations, you're in the program." What? Surely there was some clerical error. Yet that's exactly what the paper said. Best day of my life? Yes, it was a pretty good day. I had faced adversity, persevered, and come out on top. But I could have no idea the repercussions my choice to apply and the Admiral's choice to accept me, which ultimately resulted in another roadblock in my naval career, would have.
Perfect. One of my favorites. You chose a great one. I've enjoyed both reading that in your book and also hearing it from your own telling. And I have lived in the corner of the room watching that ship dash to pieces in the model. And what a character. Yeah, I love that. So this is this issue of storytelling. We've talked a little bit about how important it is in writing, in communicating. What would you say the role of storytelling is in the classroom? How have you modeled that in the classroom?
Well, I do try to be personal with my students. I want them to be personal with me. I teach undergraduate ethics, and it's very much of a discussion course and very much intended to allow them to kind of shape their personal ethic. So we have questions along the way. We have case studies along the way that I really almost demand of them a response. And if I'm going to do that, I pretty much have to demand that of myself first. And that's usually how I approach it is I say, look, I'm getting ready to ask you this question, but let me answer it and give you an example from my life first. So you know that this isn't a one-way relationship. And so in that way, I think that stories make a difference for them in terms of simply opening up their ability to kind of mine that for themselves and mine that in their own lives and share that with others. And my hope, of course, is that they kind of get used to that idea, and so they're willing to do it for their students, and they just kind of, pass it on like that.
Well said. I'm intrigued at the course that you'll be teaching this summer. I know the motivation behind it based on what you have shared, but who is this class for that you'll be teaching in June?
It tends to be retirees, but it doesn't have to be. The retirees are the ones who are primarily members of OLLI, and so they take the most advantage of the classes. But the classes are open to anyone. It's just that if you're not a member, you have to pay by class or whatever. So I've done this twice before now, and it's just been absolutely delightful because these people are so well read and have so many experiences that they come into the class with. And so that's actually one aspect of the classes. I can kind of tap into their own stories and let them, talk to me about their lives and kind of riff off of that. And so, it's just something that I really, really enjoy. And so I'm really looking forward to it.
That's excellent. And if someone would be interested in attending the class, we can put that information here in the description. Well, tremendous. Dr. Paul Schatzberger, all about storytelling. This has been very helpful, I think very revealing, and I think connecting on the deepest human level. And that's all for this episode of Moments That Matter. Thank you for tuning in to all of our listeners and to those who will enjoy these elements that Paul has brought regarding writing. You can find more information about that in the description for this podcast. And until next time, God bless, and we look forward to meeting with you once again. Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments.
We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the Clearness Committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.